There's two main flavors of acolyte. Lich, a tanky spellcaster that focuses on damage over time, or necromancer, which obviously is about bringing the dead back to life, or in the more traditional ARPG sense, summoning minions to do your bidding. Now, I wasn't sure how well the minion AI would go, so upon starting my new multiplayer character, I decided to play a Lich for the very first time in last Epoch, and the results were pretty interesting. It took a little bit to put the build together, there's still a couple things to work out. However, at this point, I've been able to push to 300 corruption, I can take on bosses, clear efficiently, and much, much more. While I did try various setups, I ultimately settled on a Hungering Souls and Wandering Spirits combination, because there's a high level of synergy between both of these necrotic damage over time skills. I'm further augmenting it with the staples of a Lich such as Reaper Form and Death Seal, though more about that in a little bit. Overall, Lich offers insane leech, solid defenses, and a really great option for a tanky spellcaster. Hungering Souls auto-targets enemies, which makes it excellent for clear, and if you're able to stand still, Wandering Spirits absolutely destroys single-target bosses. Because it's a damage over time build, there's quite a lot of persistence, meaning you don't have to have perfect uptime for it to feel good. Before I continue though, a special thanks to 11th Hour Games for sponsoring this video. If you haven't yet checked out last Epoch, you can always do so through my Nexus, link will be in the description below. So in this video, I'm going to cover the key mechanics, get into skill specializations, passives, gear, idols, blessings, a little bit about the playstyle, and then wrap everything up with my thoughts on the build so far. There's 5 key mechanics that you need to understand to play this build effectively. So be sure to pay attention to this part, and if there's anything unclear, go back to rewatch it. The first is Unholy Trinity. Most of the damage from Hungering Souls comes from having exactly 3 minions. If one of your minions dies, I strongly suggest using your skeleton mages to resummon it immediately. Also, if you get a minion shrine, things that give bees or little bugs, don't click it. This will wreck your entire DPS, as you lose a 150% more damage multiplier. A 150% more damage multiplier is essentially taking whatever damage you had and multiplying it by 2.5. This is also why you need exactly 3 skeleton mages rather than the default 2 or some other random amount of minions, which you could get by investing in various other Lich or Necromancer skills. Next up, we are using Reaper Form, which is a massive damage and defense boost along with a cheat death. Almost nothing kills you through it, so try to keep it on. However, the downside of building around Reaper Form is we're kind of a wet noodle without it. So if your Reaper Form ever gets knocked off, you're going to be extremely vulnerable, and most of your damage completely falls off. The ability to use Reaper Form is why we can seal most of our life with Death Seal. Death Seal automatically puts you in the low life state, while Reaper Form automatically puts you in the transformed state. There are also additional bonuses that I'll get into a little bit more when I talk about skill specializations. When it comes to single target damage, I advise using the channeling version of Wandering Spirits. You can either tap it for a few spirits or hold it for significantly more damage. If you notice any strange behavior, do be aware there is currently a bug with multiplayer that causes you to be stuck channeling. Just cast any sort of movement skill such as Reap or Skeleton Mages to break this, but it can be a little bit inconvenient and on higher difficulties get you stuck in something that you needed to dodge. Hopefully this will be fixed in the future, and if it is, I'll try to have a pinned comment down below letting people know. Because the build's fairly tanky, this isn't a huge inconvenience. Now Hungering Souls has a special buff called Possession. This lasts for 1.5 seconds. Luckily, Death Seal automatically casts Hungering Souls, so on single target an enemy will always be possessed. However, to get the 40% global damage over time modifier against enemies possessed by Hungering Souls, you will need to cast it yourself every 8 seconds to keep the buff up. You can see the buff icon on your character to the right of a health bar. If this is ever missing, be sure to use it manually, otherwise you can rely on the Death Seal automation most of the time. And finally, Marinas requires Self-Damnation. If you have 7 stacks of damned on you, you get a ton of Necrotic Res penetration. It's pretty difficult to stack Necrotic Res penetration for this build, and negating enemy resistances is a great way to multiply your damage. So, I strongly suggest taking the Death Seal talent that causes you to gain 2 stacks of damnation every second. The only other alternative would be a lot more cast speed, but that can be a little bit difficult to work in, given all the other prefixes this build wants. But those are the core mechanics of a Hungering Souls Wandering Spirits Lich. If you find last Epoch guide content or general ARPG content helpful, do be sure to get subscribed, otherwise you might miss a future upload like my next build. But for now, let's get into some details about the skill specializations. First up, Reaper form. My goal here is a primarily defensive setup. Mistress of Decay lowers the health drain innate to Reaper form. It also gives you a little bit of damage over time. Then, Soul Shroud gives 4 armor per point of intelligence. The goal is to have between 80 and 120 intelligence on this build, so you'll have a significant amount of armor that you wouldn't otherwise have access to. Vile Shroud is a little bit debatable because I'm overcapped on all my resistances, but if I had ideal gear, I'd want to use this for at least most of my res, if not all of it, freeing up other suffixes on my gear for more valuable things like damage, crit avoidance, and health. Remember, the goal is always to be in Reaper form, though if you're uncomfortable with dodging stuff during the small windows where it's down, it's totally fine to not use Vile Shroud at all. Haunting is very important because marked for death chance is a great way to add a little bit of extra damage to your build. Lowering enemy resistances by 25% is essentially 25% necrotic pen, and this build does hit fairly frequently. From there, I took Dark Harvest to instantly kill anything at 18% health that's hit with my Reap. Now for my last point, I grabbed Soul Release. It's kind of funny while clearing, but ultimately this should probably be something like Death Touch Scythe or Ghastly Flow for a little more quality of life. With my last points, I wrap everything up in Soul for a Soul for the generic 80% damage increase. Now, Skeleton Mages aren't actually here for damage. They're a utility movement skill. Something that I like to call Skeleport. If you want, you can take the nodes afterwards for Death's Cavalry to pull all of your Skeleton Mages to you. This can be kind of helpful for pulling them out of danger, but I also found that sometimes I ended up pulling them into danger by mistake, so instead I went for Cryomancers just to have a little bit extra slow chance. Though none of these nodes are particularly impactful, so feel free to drop them for anything else. What is very important is to have Orders of Death. This increases the maximum number of Skeleton Mages by 1, allowing you to have 3 instead of a default 2. And I found that having the Leech Life is very important for keeping them alive. If your Skeletal Mages feel squishy, that's probably because you don't have enough intelligence. You can always make them a little bit more defensive by dropping these 5 points here, taking 1 here, 3 here, and putting the last one into some crit strike avoidance. In fact, if you're going that route, you can technically put all 4 points in crit strike avoidance and drop some of it Cellar Morty. Then we have Hungering Souls, one of the main damage scalers of this build and the source of most of my clear. I currently have a +3 chest, so keep in mind that some of the later points I mention will be considered optional. To start off with, there's 2 important branches you want to take. The first is Grave Bond into Unholy Trinity. If you have exactly 3 minions, this gives you a massive damage bonus to your Hungering Souls. I prefer to path through Forbidden Pact because losing 2 projectiles isn't terrible, the extra spell damage is quite nice, and Ravenous only applies on hit, not to the damage over time portion. The other important branch is Inspired Hunger for 40% more global damage over time versus possessed enemies. From there, I went into Risen Cemetery for an extra projectile chance, and finished off with Descent into Madness for 100% more damage over time. Think of this as doubling your skills-based damage. For the last couple points, I decided to grab Dominion of Undeath, which makes the skill far more mana efficient, and a little bit in Necrotic Emanation, though this point could honestly be put anywhere else and it would be fine. You could grab another point in Dominion of Undeath for mana cost, Soul Swarm for extra projectiles, or Life Hunt to increase the maximum range of a skill by just a little bit. Then Wandering Spirits functions as the build's single target. While the tooltip doesn't look particularly impressive, once the spirits stack up, they do very significant numbers. I've seen ticks over 100,000 on the dummy, some of which got as high as 300,000. Now to start with, I'm taking Song of the Lost Chantry. This turns it into a channeling skill and allows you to summon vastly more spirits. Just as a quick demonstration, as I channel here for just a second, you'll see the screen rapidly fill. Or, if I tap the button very quickly, you'll see a few spirits appear. Either way works, however, do be aware of a bug and sometimes you'll get stuck. Just use your Skeleton Mages to quickly teleport away and break the glitch. From there, I focused everything into making them do as much damage as possible. This meant increasing the size and their area of effect so that I could get as many overlaps as I could. Grabbing Spectral Putrescence, allowing them to hit, applying poison, which does a very small amount of damage from my generic scaling, in addition to applying on hit effects like Damnation and of course Marked for Death. Over here, I'm using Familiar Souls to overall reduce the area of effect of a skill, thus concentrating the damage more for a single target. Lingering Souls is 39% more spirit duration, which is 39% more damage. And finally, I'm using Reap the Damned, for spirits deal more damage to cursed enemies and damned enemies. Now, depending on your own preferences, you could drop Poison Mines in Spectral Putrescence, you could drop 1 point in Lingering Souls, you might not need all of a mana sustain from Infusing Souls, and you might want 1 extra point in Daunting Presence. But ultimately, I couldn't really measure any differences no matter what configuration I used, and just by kind of blind feel, this did seem to be the best after fighting a bunch of bosses and clearing a bunch of echoes. And then finally, I have Death Seal. Death Seal serves 2 purposes. First, on the left side branch, I use Deadlock to lower my life, and Desperate Shroud to gain a lot of additional armor. On the right side, I'm getting Devouring Release to automatically cast Hungering Souls. This means I only have to manually cast it once every 8 seconds, and while clearing, I get a lot of free damage. Then for the rest of my points, I'm increasing the duration, getting some quality of life, and using the Self-Damnation to keep the buff up on my Marinas. Now, I'm going to go over the passives quickly. To start off with, in Acolyte, one of the most important nodes to have is Eye of Damnation. This is where I'm getting most of my damage chance, and it makes my damage far more reliable. Another important node to have is Soul Aegis, because that's largely responsible for keeping my skeletal mages alive. Furthermore, I'm using Forbidden Knowledge to stack as much intelligence as possible. In Necromancer, I needed 5 points to unlock skeletal mages, so I grabbed Grave Thorns to make my minions just a little bit tankier. Most of my investment is, of course, in Lich. I'm prioritizing intelligence, necrotic damage, and vitality, so you'll see a lot of that throughout my choices. Though there are a couple notable exceptions that I'll get to towards the end. For example, 3 Plagues' Necrotic Pen. This is another damage multiplier which we don't have many sources of, so you should take it wherever possible. Necrotic Energy offers flat spell damage, which of course scales our damage over time effects. At the end, Soul Maw is Leech and Increased Health Leech, which makes your Leech more effective. Plus, Corrosive Consciousness is great because it double dips as we deal both spell damage and damage over time. Finally, my idols, gear, and blessings. To start off with, I don't think my gear is ideal here. There's quite a lot of room for improvement, but it should be good enough to give you a basic idea of what I have and where to go from here. Starting off from my idols, I have chance to apply Damned on hit, increased spell damage at low life, increased necrotic damage, increased damage while transformed. From there, I'm also trying to grab some health and resistances just to fill in where needed. As it turns out, I ended up with too much Phys Res, so I should probably swap that for something else, such as Lightning Res, or look to reduce my physical res on gear. For a build like this, there aren't any idols that are build enabling. Next up, for my blessings, some of them matter and some of them don't. So here are the ones that matter. First up, Grand Memory of Light. For increased health, this comes from the Black Sun. Next, Grand Light of the Moon. Because mana does scale my damage, albeit with a very small contribution, doing Ending the Storm until you get mana is a pretty good option. Grand Survival of Might from Reign of Dragons is very important. This is where the build gets almost all of its crit strike avoidance. You'll be very vulnerable to critical strikes if you don't have this, or if you don't have 1 crit strike avoidance roll somewhere else on your gear. Now, because my cold res is a little scuffed, I'm fixing it with Grand Protection of Heorot, though this isn't necessarily the only option that you could take. If you're missing Phys Res instead, Grand Resolve of Grail works totally fine, and if you have all your resistances, Grand Bones of Eternity will make you more resistant to damage whenever you block. However, far and above, the most important blessing to get is Grand Promise of Death. This gives you Necrotic Res Shred on hit, and is a great way to scale your damage. While there are several good defensive options, such as the Armor or the Endurance, it's really hard to replace the Res Shred, as this build's options are pretty limited. Now, I'm going to go over the items quickly. First up, Marina's Lost Soul. Spell necrotic damage is great, as base damage is quite hard to get. Plus, it gives a massive amount of necrotic penetration for the Possess, since we should almost always be at 7 stacks of Damned. Now, while the 10% reduced health is unfortunate, it's really hard to get anything better. Maybe a Hybrid Scepter with really high base damage could work, but I haven't found one that gives me comparable damage, at least so far. Try to get an Immortal's Crown. This makes sure that your Reaper Form and Death Seal come off cooldown as quickly as possible. Personally, I wanted one with +3 to Hungering Souls, though that's not necessarily mandatory. Wherever possible, you should definitely try to get increased health, and something like increased necrotic damage while transformed is a quite nice damage boost. On your chest piece, aim for +3 to Wandering Souls. For a base, something that gives all resistance would be quite nice. I just haven't been very lucky in getting that with the +3 to Wandering Spirits. And I do value the extra level, as Wandering Spirits is so point-starved that I'd use +4 if I could find it. Now when it comes to belt and boots, aim for cooldown recovery speed. Again, you want your Reaper form and Death Seal to have as much uptime as possible. If need be, seal off a bad mod using a Glyph of Despair, though there's quite a bit of room for improvement in this item. Technically what I should have is something like cooldown recovery speed, hybrid health, mana regen, which would be sealed off, necrotic damage, and then minion health for the last mod. Similarly, on my boots, they're pretty good, but it should be hybrid health. I should have vitality sealed instead of movement speed, and the intelligence is actually perfectly best in slot. Now in terms of stats on gloves, be sure to get an endurance base, it's absolutely the best choice. As for prefixes and suffixes, intelligence, damage over time, necrotic damage, even cast speed are all pretty good, minion health helps as you need it some places, and intelligence is a way to scale your damage. For suffixes, look for resistances, life, and crit avoidance. This gearing honestly doesn't apply just to your gloves, but also applies to your rings, as most of them have pretty similar stats. On your amulet, the same thing applies, but you should always try to work in necrotic penetration, which is a prefix wherever available. And in terms of using a bone amulet, I could probably go for a different base, since right now I'm significantly over my resistance cap. On your relic, try to get a Decaying Homunculus, since this gives necrotic damage. As for the rest of the stats, I'm using it because I wanted the endurance. The freeze rate multiplier is actually quite useless, but I haven't had much luck in replacing it, because I haven't really farmed for it. As you can probably see, this is my gear in its current state, not the ideal, though a little more on that later. Then finally, I opted to use a shield instead of an offhand. While an offhand is more damage, I feel like this build has damage to spare, and I really wanted to have the extra block chance and block effectiveness for tankiness. In terms of suffixes, it's kind of like the rest. Get life, resistances, crit avoidance, whatever you need, you should have it here. And so that covers the basics of my skills, passives, gear, idols, and blessings. Now, if you want a planner as a reference, I'll have a link on screen right now, which you can always pause the video and copy over. It'll have one gear set with my current gear, and one gear set with ideal gear. Feel free to swap between them. If you want something that's potentially a little bit more up to date, or simply don't want to have to copy over a link manually, be sure to hop over to my Discord and react to give yourself a community role, where I can more easily keep it up to date if I change anything with a build in the future. When I started Necrotic DoT Lich, I didn't really have a plan in mind. I decided I'd just go with whatever skills looked good, and try things as I went. I tried hit-based Hungering Souls, something that you might have seen before, which is the far more popular version of a build. And it was okay, but felt very awkward, especially when clearing. I could nuke down a single thing, and crowds of enemies overwhelmed me. Then I tried the Shotgunning Staff, which was also pretty awkward, and I could nuke down single targets, but crowds of enemies overwhelmed me. Hungering Souls seemed to work really well, but I needed something to augment it. I tried Spirit Plague, and the damage felt kind of lackluster, especially as I pushed to 300 Corruption. I tried Drain Life, which had good single target, but I couldn't sustain the mana and didn't feel like reworking my build all around that. Then I tried Soul Feast, which also had really good damage, at the cost of all my mana, just like Drain Life. So what I ended up settling on was Wandering Spirits. It hits the perfect middle ground between something that does really high damage, something with pretty good quality of life as the spirits do persist, and something that I can spam over and over again without too much concern. So far, the build's been pretty good. I went past wave 100 in the arena, I've pushed to 300 Corruption, I've killed plenty of bosses and Oribus's, I did try to do the dungeons. Unfortunately, I ran into some issues, but hopefully that'll be fixed soon, in which case I want to try some bosses like Julra. So overall, I'd say this build's pretty good at doing all content. When clearing, it's really nice to have Death Seal automatically casting Hungering Souls. The playstyle is pretty simple, just teleport around summoning mages, and if you need to delete something in specific, just stop and channel for a bit. If you were to play something like this in multiplayer, it's not really a support, though it can have somewhat supporting features, because enemies will naturally be drawn to attacking your minions rather than you or your friends. Similarly, by applying things such as Necrotic Res Shred or Poison to an enemy, you could increase your friend's damage if they're playing a build dealing either necrotic or poison damage. Furthermore, because it has highly efficient clear, it would pair well with a build that does pure single target. And you could always reconfigure it more for single target, and pair it well with a build that clears quickly. Because it's a nice well-rounded build, it's also quite good at party play where you might want to split up from your friends. So let's say you're paired with a Blade Dancer who's really speedy, but can't necessarily take on the boss. They could clear the monolith for extra stability, while you rush to the boss and deal with it really quick. Because 0.9 now supports multiplayer, if you're playing online, which you definitely should be, there's lots of options to party up with your friends. Alternatively, because this build struggles to stack Necrotic res shred, you could always pair it with another Necrotic build that happens to hit rapidly or otherwise shred enemy resistances very efficiently. Your Damned also negates enemy life regeneration, so any build that deals large hits with inconsistent burst windows is going to be greatly helped by this, especially in regards to enemies that heal quickly if they haven't been damaged recently. Your dots are very persistent and quite hard for enemies to get rid of. So while this build isn't necessarily a dedicated support or carry, there are certainly lots of options to use it with other players. This was actually my first acolyte character, and so far it's been quite a bit of fun. This was very straightforward to put together, and while the Marinas is a significant damage increase, it's far from required to play the build, so there are no mandatory uniques. There's no mandatory relics, there's no mandatory anything. If you're looking for a starter that scales pretty well without gear and gets even better once you obtain some, I'd definitely say this is a good choice. With that said, I'm curious, have you played Acolyte before, and if so, do you prefer Lich or Necromancer? Be sure to defend your choices down in the comments below. Before I go, another big thanks to 11th Hour Games for sponsoring the video. If anything in this video looked interesting to you, and you want to check out Last Epoch for yourself, do be sure to use my Nexus link down below to buy the game, while also helping to support the channel. Speaking of support, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members, without whom I wouldn't be able to make videos just like this one. If you're looking for something else to watch, maybe you need a beginner's guide to monoliths, crafting, or loot filters, that'll be up in the card and down in the description below. Or you can always go with whatever YouTube recommends, which will be on screen right now. That's all for me today. I hope you enjoyed cosplaying as Katarina in Last Epoch, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.